The reason most home gardeners grow corn in long, thin rows genuinely has nothing to do with corn itself. It has everything to do with tractors instead, a machine most backyard gardeners will never actually own. That straight row layout appearing in nearly every gardening book published across the last 100 years exists for machinery. It was designed specifically for mechanical cultivation, mechanical harvest, and the economics of large-scale commodity agriculture. That gap between machine-designed layouts and plant biology rarely gets questioned until someone examines it closely. A tractor can drive down a perfectly straight row without much trouble navigating between individual plants. A mechanical harvester can strip ears cleanly off plants lined up neatly in single-file rows. The entire infrastructure of modern corn farming, spacing recommendations included, was built for machines, never for the plant. When home gardeners copy that exact layout into a backyard bed, they're planting for a tractor that's never coming. The corn plant itself genuinely doesn't care about neat rows. It cares about exactly one single thing: pollen. A seed packet's spacing instructions rarely explain the actual reasoning behind those specific numbers printed on the back. A single design choice made a century ago still quietly shapes how most gardening advice gets written today. Corn ranks among the only major garden crops in temperate regions that relies entirely on wind pollination. The tassel at the top of each plant produces pollen, sometimes millions of individual grains per single tassel. That pollen must fall downward onto silk emerging from the ear positioned below that same tassel. Every single silk on an ear of corn connects to exactly one potential kernel waiting to develop. If that silk catches a pollen grain, the kernel develops fully, otherwise it simply stays blank permanently. Watching a corn ear come out half empty tends to be blamed on soil or weather, rather than layout. The ear harvested in August represents a direct map showing exactly which silks received pollen and which didn't. Every gap and every undeveloped spot on a cob represents a silk that never actually received pollen. Here's exactly where standard row layout quietly destroys an entire harvest without anyone realizing the actual cause. When corn grows in a single long row, pollen released from tassels gets carried by whatever breeze blows. Wind direction that particular morning entirely determines where all that released pollen actually ends up landing. Machinery efficiency and plant biology were never really the same problem, despite decades of advice treating them identically. 2 centuries of continuous practice rarely gets consulted before someone plants their own very first corn patch. If wind blows across the row, pollen sails right past the plants and lands uselessly on open ground. If wind blows along the row, only the first few plants catch most of that available pollen supply. In a long, thin row, 40 to 60% of silk on most ears never receives any pollen whatsoever. That represents the gap, the half-formed ear, and the bald patch making gardeners blame soil or weather. None of those things actually ruined that particular harvest. The underlying planting layout itself caused the real problem. University research eventually confirming older farming wisdom is a pattern worth noticing across many traditional practices. Amish farmers across Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, and parts of Wisconsin have grown corn differently for over 200 years. That difference becomes visible immediately when someone actually looks at how those plants get physically arranged. No long single rows and no double rows with wide aisles separate typical Amish corn plantings at all. Reduced fertilizer reliance is a quiet benefit that compounds across an entire growing season without extra effort. Amish corn instead grows in dense rectangular blocks, tight grids of plants spaced closely together throughout. A pattern proven across 2 centuries of continuous use deserves more attention than a single trending gardening tip. Those blocks run at least 4 rows deep and 4 rows wide, often considerably larger than that minimum. A wall of tassels releasing pollen simultaneously changes the entire pollination math compared to a scattered thin row. From any direction approached, a block planting looks like a genuinely solid wall of corn plants. That solid wall arrangement represents the entire underlying point behind this completely different planting approach. When pollen falls from tassels within a block planting, it never simply sails past plants onto empty ground. Regardless of wind direction, north, south, east, west, or anywhere between those directions, pollen consistently lands on silk. The plant directly downwind catches some pollen, while the plant behind it catches considerably more still. Interior plants catching pollen from every direction at once explains why block centers often produce the fullest ears. Interior plants, surrounded by tassels on all four sides, catch pollen arriving from literally every direction simultaneously. The result is what agronomists call high pollination efficiency, typically 90% or higher across the entire block. Ears come out full, dense, and packed completely from base to tip with fully developed kernels throughout. In many standard varieties, that high pollination efficiency actually triggers plants to develop a second productive ear. Watching pollen carried away uselessly by a crosswind explains a mystery many gardeners never think to investigate. That second ear develops further down the same stalk, something almost never happening in thin row plantings. A second ear developing further down the stalk is nature rewarding successful pollination with additional reproductive investment. The plant simply lacks sufficient pollination success in row plantings to justify that additional reproductive investment. That represents the genuine double harvest this entire approach makes possible through pure planting geometry alone. This isn't a magic variety, a special fertilizer, or any kind of hidden trick whatsoever involved here. It's simply geometry, since plant arrangement in space directly determines how much pollen reaches how many silks. That pollination rate then determines both kernel set per ear and whether a plant produces 1 or 2 ears. None of this requires special seed or rare fertilizer, just a different arrangement of ordinary plants in space. Block planting essentially doubles corn harvest by solving a pollination problem the row layout itself originally created. Multiple university extension programs across the country now specifically recommend block planting for home gardeners exactly because of this. This isn't folk wisdom dressed up as science. It's science that folk wisdom got right 2 centuries earlier. Geometry alone, with no new inputs at all, accounts for the entire difference between these two approaches. Planting a proper block, though, isn't quite as simple as merely scattering seed within a square shape. This method involves 4 specific principles, making the difference between a well-pollinated block and an underperforming one. Recognizing that pattern early saves years of disappointing harvests, blamed on the wrong underlying cause entirely. Missing even one of those 4 principles causes a block to underperform, though not as badly as thin rows. First principle, block size, carrying a hard minimum that matters more than almost anything else in this method. 4 rows by 4 rows, 16 plants arranged in a grid, represents the absolute floor for this approach. Below that specific number, the underlying pollination math simply stops working reliably across the entire planting. There simply aren't enough tassels releasing pollen simultaneously to guarantee adequate coverage for interior ear silks. A brief morning ritual costing almost nothing in time can noticeably shift the odds toward a fuller harvest. A hard minimum block size matters more than any other single variable in this entire planting method. 3 rows deep might visually look like a block, yet wind still pushes most pollen out the sides. 2 rows functions, essentially the same as a single row, offering only slightly better odds overall. A block that looks crowded to modern eyes was simply normal to farmers working without any machinery at all. A 4x4 arrangement is genuinely where the underlying physics finally tips in a gardener's favor. 5x5 performs even better, while 6x6 proves genuinely strong under most growing conditions. An 8x8 block, 64 plants in a tight grid, approaches efficiency commercial fields achieve at scale. Rows that merely look like a block still leak most of their pollen out the exposed sides. For most home gardeners working a standard raised bed, the practical sweet spot sits between 4x4 and 6x6. That range covers 16 to 36 plants, fitting comfortably within 64 to 150 square feet. That leads directly into the second principle covering proper spacing between individual corn plants throughout the block. Most seed packets recommend spacing corn 12 to 15 inches apart within rows, 30 to 36 inches between rows. That specific spacing exists purely for mechanical cultivation, leaving room for tractor-mounted equipment to pass through safely. Tight spacing that initially looks crowded actually mirrors how corn naturally grows in dense, wild stands. In a home garden relying on hand weeding or mulching, that extra between row distance becomes genuinely wasted space. Nutrient competition in tight spacing is a manageable trade-off once the soil gets properly prepared beforehand. It dilutes the block, spreads tassels further apart, and reduces the pollination density, making block planting effective. Amish spacing, matching what university extension programs recommend for intensive home production, runs considerably tighter overall. 8 to 12 inches between plants in every direction, both within rows and between rows, works best here. A 4x4 block at 10-inch spacing occupies roughly 40 inches by 40 inches total space. Richer soil becomes non-negotiable once plants sit closer together, competing for the same limited nutrients. That's just over 3 feet by 3 feet, fitting inside a single standard raised bed easily. Plants will look genuinely crowded to gardeners accustomed to wide-row commercial-style layouts initially seeing this. This actually mirrors how corn naturally grows in its original environment, tightly clustered and competing upward for light. That clustering benefits plants through mutual wind shelter and the pollination density this exact arrangement provides. Tight spacing does carry a real cost, requiring careful management throughout an entire growing season. A soaker hose run on a schedule beats sporadic light watering for keeping a dense block properly hydrated. Closer plants mean more competition for water and nutrients across every available square foot of growing space. Consistent deep watering on a schedule beats guessing at soil moisture based on appearance alone. A block-planted corn patch needs considerably richer soil than an equivalent row-planted corn patch requires. Working 2 to 3 inches of finished compost into the top 6 inches of soil matters enormously beforehand. Corn ranks as a genuinely heavy nitrogen feeder, heavier than almost any other common garden crop grown. That compost provides the slow-release nutrient-based plants need to grow successfully through each other without starving. Mulch applied at the right time suppresses weeds without ever needing to till between tightly spaced plants. A side dressing of additional compost or balanced organic fertilizer, once plants reach knee height, provides mid-season boost. Spreading harvest across weeks rather than days solves a problem most gardeners simply accept as unavoidable. That boost helps the block successfully carry 2 ears per stalk all the way through to full maturity. Watering the block deeply and less frequently works better than watering lightly and more often throughout the season. A soaker hose threaded through the block at ground level, run for an hour once or twice weekly, works well. That approach keeps the root zone properly saturated without wetting foliage, which matters for preventing fungal problems. Brace roots doing the job of an anchor explain why a single storm can flatten an unhilled block overnight. A stable soil temperature under mulch protects roots through exactly the week's heat stress matters most. Mulching the block with 3 to 4 inches of straw or shredded leaves once plants reach 8 to 10 inches tall helps enormously. That mulch holds moisture between waterings, suppresses weeds without cultivation, and keeps soil temperature stable through summer heat. The third principle covers something most gardeners skip entirely, preventing the single biggest physical failure in home corn growing. Hilling means mounding soil around the base of each corn stalk once plants reach roughly 12 to 18 inches tall. Corn carries a unique root structure among garden vegetables, developing specialized aerial roots called brace roots as it grows. 10 minutes of hilling once at knee height is a small task with an outsized protective payoff. Those brace roots emerge from the lowest nodes above the soil line, angling downward back into the ground. These brace roots function as the plant's genuine structural anchoring system against wind and physical stress overall. In an open field with wide spacing, a single corn plant stays genuinely vulnerable to complete wind throw. In a tight block, plants shelter each other somewhat, though outer windward plants remain genuinely exposed still. Hilling, pulling 2 to 3 inches of soil up around each stalk's base, accomplishes 2 important things simultaneously. An anchor system built into the plant itself only works if it actually reaches moist soil in time. A single thunderstorm testing an entire season's work is exactly the risk hilling exists to prevent. It buries emerging brace roots, giving them immediate contact with moist soil to establish anchoring before storms hit. It also physically stabilizes each stalk's base against lateral force from wind or heavy rain events. Amish farmers typically hill their corn once when plants reach knee height, using a simple hoe for the work. That entire process takes roughly 10 minutes for a typical home gardener's block-sized corn planting. Tassel timing mismatched by even a few days can quietly undo an otherwise perfectly spaced block. Skipping this step means a single strong July thunderstorm can flatten an entire block overnight without warning. Doing it once means that same block stands through nearly everything short of a genuine tornado event. The fourth principle covers variety synchronization, separating a genuinely good block from a truly great one. Corn pollination stays genuinely time-sensitive, with each tassel shedding pollen for roughly 5 to 10 days total. Each silk remains receptive for roughly that same window of time during the plant's reproductive cycle. Skipping a 10-minute task feels harmless right up until the first real storm of the season arrives. One variety planted together stays synchronized in a way mixed varieties genuinely cannot replicate reliably. If tassels on half a block shed pollen before silks on the other half even emerge, mismatch occurs. That mismatch produces the same half-formed ears bad row spacing causes, even within an otherwise well-designed block. The fix stays genuinely simple, planting exactly one variety per block rather than mixing multiple varieties together. A single variety planted the same day will tassel within a 2 to 3 day window across the entire block. None of this demands rare skill, just a willingness to plant differently than the seed packet suggests. Silks will emerge within that same tight window, creating almost perfect overlap and pollination efficiency above 90%. 50 feet of separation between different varieties is a small buffer protecting an entire harvest's flavor profile. Growing multiple varieties, which many gardeners genuinely want to do for flavor variety, requires proper physical separation instead. Planting different varieties in separate blocks spaced at least 50 feet apart prevents significant cross-pollination issues. That 50-foot distance particularly matters when growing a super sweet variety alongside a standard sugary variety nearby. Cross-pollination between those two types produces starchy, tough kernels, ruining the super sweet variety's intended flavor. Several classic heirloom and hybrid varieties perform particularly well, specifically within this exact block planting approach. A few days of mistimed tasseling can undo weeks of otherwise careful spacing and soil preparation. Choosing a proven variety removes one more variable from an already carefully managed planting system. One reliable heirloom variety matures around 78 days with dependable pollination and genuinely exceptional flavor quality. Another heirloom shoepeg type offers irregularly spaced kernels with rich, creamy sweetness around 93 days maturity. A late-season white corn variety offers outstanding flavor around 95 days to full maturity. A reliable hybrid white sweet corn performs excellently in block plantings around 92 days to maturity. For colder northern growing zones, a multicolored flint corn variety bred for short seasons matures in roughly 60 days. An indigenous planting method surviving centuries of change speaks to how genuinely sound its underlying logic is. That covers the 4 core principles: block size minimum, tight spacing, hilling once, and single variety synchronization. Missing even one causes underperformance, while nailing all 4 produces corn fundamentally different from any row-planted patch. One additional layer exists worth adding to this entire system, predating even the Amish tradition by thousands of years. That layer turns a genuinely good corn block into a genuinely complete food production system entirely. Isolation distance between varieties is cheap insurance against ruining an entire season's flavor with one mistake. This particular method originated with indigenous peoples of the Northeast long before any European settlement reached the continent. Beans fixing nitrogen for free removes a fertilizer step most gardeners assume is always necessary. Numerous indigenous nations developed what's now widely called the Three Sisters planting method independently across many regions. Amish farmers later adopted variations of this exact approach after settling across Pennsylvania and Ohio historically. The Three Sisters method plants corn, beans, and squash together within the same block as mutual support. Corn provides vertical structure for beans to climb, while beans fix atmospheric nitrogen feeding both corn and squash. Squash spreads across ground between stalks, shading soil while suppressing weeds and holding moisture through summer heat. Squash shading bare soil between stalks does the work a layer of mulch would otherwise need to do. Within the block planting method already covered, this Three Sisters layer fits together quite naturally overall. Planting the corn block first at the spacing already covered, 8 to 12 inches in a 4x4 grid, starts this process. Once corn reaches roughly 6 inches tall, planting pole bean seeds at the base of every second or third stalk works well. Reliable, well-tested varieties remove guesswork from a system that already has enough variables to manage. Beans will climb the corn once stalks grow strong enough to support that weight, typically around knee height. 2 weeks after beans go in, planting winter squash or pumpkin seeds at the block's corners and outer margins follows. Waiting for a sturdy stalk before adding climbing beans prevents a completely avoidable, disappointing setback. A single successful season tends to be all it takes to permanently change how someone plants corn afterward. Butternut, acorn squash, or small pie pumpkins work particularly well for this specific companion planting purpose. Avoiding giant squash varieties that sprawl too aggressively and smother the corn matters for overall system balance. Using pole beans rather than bush beans matters enormously, since bush beans won't climb and compete for ground space. Reliable pole bean varieties wrap around corn stalks naturally, producing vertically without stealing floor space from the system. Planting beans too early risks corn bending or snapping if vines reach the stalk before it's thick enough. 3 staple crops from one footprint is efficiency few other gardening methods can genuinely match. Waiting until corn reaches at least 6 inches tall with a genuinely sturdy stalk prevents that specific problem. The Three Sisters layer doesn't double corn yield on its own, since block geometry already handles that entirely. A method surviving unchanged for centuries across multiple cultures is rarely coincidence or mere tradition alone. What it actually does is triple total food output from that exact same footprint of growing space. From a single block, roughly the size of a large dining table, corn, dried beans, and squash all emerge. 3 complete staple crops come from one planting that supports itself nutritionally throughout the entire growing season. A block generating its own fertility through companion planting reduces reliance on purchased soil amendments significantly. Nitrogen beans add to soil also reduces or eliminates needing mid-season compost side dressing entirely. The block essentially generates its own ongoing fertility as the entire growing season progresses naturally. For gardeners wanting to keep things simple, the corn block alone still dramatically outperforms any row planting. The Three Sisters layer functions as a genuine enhancement, while block geometry itself remains the true foundation. 2 additional bonus practices exist that push this entire system even further with minimal extra effort required. 5 minutes of morning tassel shaking is a small ritual with a genuinely measurable impact on kernel set. Both take under 5 minutes per session while genuinely compounding the eventual harvest results significantly. The first bonus practice involves hand pollination assistance, something smaller scale Amish growers have done for generations. Free nitrogen from a companion plant is the kind of detail that quietly pays for itself every season. Early in the morning, before dew fully dries, walking through the block and gently shaking each tassel helps. Pollen releases in a visible cloud, settling downward onto the silks of surrounding plants throughout the block. This never replaces wind pollination. It simply supplements it during periods when natural wind conditions prove insufficient. Still, windless mornings are exactly when this small manual step matters most for reliable pollination. On genuinely still mornings with no breeze, this 5-minute walkthrough can meaningfully boost overall kernel set percentage. Doing this every morning, during the 5 to 7 days when silks stay fresh and receptive matters most. Silks appear green or pale yellow, and feel slightly sticky when genuinely receptive to pollination during that window. Once silks turn brown and dry, that window closes, and shaking tassels no longer provides any real benefit. The second bonus practice involves succession block planting, rather than planting all corn on a single day. Succession planting turns a 2-week glut into a steady supply lasting through an entire growing season. Most gardeners plant everything at once, harvesting it all within a tight 2-week window at summer's end. Ground shaded naturally by broad leaves does double duty as both weed suppression and moisture retention. That represents a genuine feast or famine approach, 2 weeks of surplus corn followed by nothing afterward. That shift in perspective is really the biggest takeaway from this entire block planting approach. The alternative involves planting a new block every 2 to 3 weeks across an extended planting season. Each block reaches maturity at a different time, providing continuous fresh corn from midsummer through early autumn. In moderate growing zones, that typically means 3 to 4 separate succession blocks planted across a season. Matching variety across staggered blocks removes the single biggest risk in any succession planting attempt. In colder zones, 2 blocks might work well, while warmer zones might support 5 or 6 successive blocks. The critical rule for succession planting involves careful variety isolation between blocks planted at different times. If succession blocks overlap in tasseling windows while sitting within 50 feet of each other, cross-pollination causes problems. Using the same variety across every succession block eliminates that concern entirely, regardless of timing overlap. Alternatively, spacing blocks far enough apart prevents pollen drift from causing cross-contamination between different plantings. A layout built for machines rarely serves a gardener working entirely by hand in a small backyard plot. Patience waiting for a sturdy stalk avoids a setback that costs far more time to recover from. Same variety with staggered timing represents the simplest, most reliable approach for most home gardeners attempting this. Here's the real lesson worth taking from all of this, extending well beyond corn growing specifically. The row planting paradigm dominating modern home gardening was genuinely never designed for home gardens at all. It was designed entirely for machines, and copying that layout into a small backyard plot inherits every inefficiency. None of the mechanical advantages that originally made row planting sensible at commercial scale transfer to backyard gardens. Watching results repeat season after season is what eventually convinces even the most skeptical row planting gardener. Amish farmers never adopted that paradigm, simply because they never adopted the machines it was originally built around. They kept planting the way corn plants themselves genuinely want to grow: dense, clustered, and mutually supportive. Results across seasons and centuries speak clearly for themselves regarding which approach actually produces better outcomes. Growing genuinely excellent corn never requires a full farm. Just 16 square feet and 16 seeds arranged properly. That fits inside a single raised bed, a corner of a small backyard, or a patch no bigger than a bathroom floor. Getting 3 crops from one footprint is the kind of efficiency worth designing an entire garden around. A single raised bed producing this kind of harvest challenges most assumptions about how much space corn needs. From that tiny footprint, planted tight, hilled once, fed with compost and given full sun exposure, real results follow. Full ears with dense kernels from base to tip, often producing 2 full ears per single stalk, become realistic. That represents exactly the kind of corn that makes anyone reconsider everything left on the table through years of row planting. Starting small makes genuine sense here. One 4x4 block with 16 seeds of a reliable variety. 8 to 12-inch spacing. Hilling once at knee height and shaking tassels each morning completes the basic method. That first full ear, pulled in August, tends to be the moment doubt turns into lasting conviction. Standing in front of that block in August, pulling the very first full ear, reveals the genuine difference immediately. So, here is a genuine question worth sitting with. Which corn variety would go into a first block planting attempt? Drop that answer in the comments below, since every single one gets read and genuinely considered afterward. If this changed how a corn patch gets planned, hitting subscribe brings new breakdowns exactly like this weekly. Nobody who tries proper block planting ever really goes back to thin rows again after seeing the difference firsthand.